As this unit of the course is concerned primarily with the development of law as well as warfare, I think it's important to look at what is arguably the world's first code of laws. Although to call it a code of laws is a bit of a misnomer, because all it is, and if you've read any of it, you'll have a sense of this, is a series of hypotheticals, right? If this happens, then this should be the legal punishment or the solution, right, to the legal problem, rather than laying out like these are the principles. But we can, by looking at the Code of Hammurabi, begin to extrapolate from there the legal principles upon which it is based. Hammurabi, as we've said, in the early part of the 18th century BCE, conquered most of Mesopotamia. And to help solidify the territory he ruled over, he then had these pillars or stela made. The stela itself, this is the best surviving one, depicts Hammurabi standing in front of the god Shamash here. And Shamash, the god of justice, that's important, is handing over to Hammurabi a scroll. All books at this point in time were written on scrolls that you unrolled to read rather than codices, which you turn the pages of like the books we know today. That was a later development. And so he's handing him the scroll of laws, and then on the stela itself is written the text of the Code of Hammurabi in cuneiform. And so, that's, and then this was put up in public so that everyone would have a way to see it, and this would become standardized. At least that's what seems to be going on. Let's take a look at some of the text of the Code of Hammurabi, okay? It starts out by, Hammurabi's essentially proclaiming himself and saying that he was chosen by the gods to do this, that Marduk, the god of Babylon, and, Shamash is mentioned, and some others have given him power to bring about peace and justice in the land, and that therefore this is the set of laws that are put into place to make sure that society exists in harmony. Now, let's not confuse this with, gods declaring that people need to be ethical because the gods have declared it needs to be so, right? There's little mention in here, in fact, there's no mention that, God is the one proclaiming these things. Rather, these laws are almost certainly born of trial and error of actual practice, where people sort of figured out, like, okay, this is the best way to run society. The connection between ethics and the notion of the will of God or the gods is a later development. We will talk about the axial age later in this term, and discuss the beginnings of that idea about ethics. That's not to say there are no ethics here, right? But it's not necessarily proclaimed by God and tied to one standing before God or anything like that. Now, as I said, this is just a set of hypotheticals, and there are 200 and how many? 200, I was going to say about 280 of these, right? Obviously, we don't have time to look at very many of them. A couple of points, though, that I want to make, right? There's a lot of discussion in here, and a lot of these specific laws have to do with property. And so a question you always have to ask when you're reading a legal text from any civilization is, what's being protected? If you look at number 3 in the Code of Laws here, if anyone bring an accusation of any crime before the elders and does not prove what he has charged, he shall, if it be a capital offense charge, be put to death. Imagine if, the litigation between different interests in the modern day, right? If one company was suing another company for something like patent infringement, if the penalty they were seeking, let's say they're seeking, I don't know, $5 billion or something like that, if they couldn't prove that the other company had infringed upon their patent, that punishment would rebound on them and they would have to pay $5 billion. I think that would probably put an end to frivolous litigation. I'm not saying that that's what should happen in the modern day, but that's what's trying to be prevented here. The question is why, okay? And one of the things to note is that those who were in charge of the judicial process were the elites. They were the powerful people. In the last video, we talked about the advice letter of the Akkadian father to his son, and we mentioned that the powerful people could kind of act with impunity in this society. They could do what they wanted, and that the legal system was not impartial in that way. And so, those who administer the law were privileged. If you're wasting their time, then there's going to be a punishment for that, okay? And we can see that protection of property and status in a lot of these other laws. Look at number 6. If anyone steal the property of a temple or of the court, both very powerful, privileged institutions, he shall be put to death. I mean, there's just no question, right? And also the one who receives a stolen thing from him shall be put to death. So this guy steals something from the temple. He goes out and sells it in a back alley to some merchant. The poor guy's out there, and without realizing that it's a hot item, trying to sell it, it's found, and both the thief and the guy he sold it to get put to death, right? So you just don't mess around with powerful institutions. And there's a lot to this, okay? There's a lot of laws deal with trade. This is an area of the world, certainly a civilization, where trade was kind of its lifeblood, in addition to warfare, right? And there's a lot of protection of soldiers and things like that who were privileged in the society, right? So a lot of laws deal with trade. A lot of laws deal with family issues, and this is the last part of this that I want to cover. There's obviously so much more that we could do with this, and I would encourage you to take a close look at this and see what you can do by way of interpretation. But the legal position of women within families, particularly within marriages, is covered in a lot of detail here. Look at number 129 as an example. If a man's wife be surprised, this is of course a euphemism for being caught in the act of adultery, surprised with another man, both shall be tied and thrown into the water. This is a pretty typical way of executing people. Tie them up, throw them in the water, they drown. The rivers obviously are, the important geographic features, and so it's also a convenient way to carry out executions. But then look at the clause that comes after that. The husband may pardon his wife, and the king his slaves. And so, if what this is saying essentially is the court's jurisdiction does not extend into the private sphere. That if the slave of a king is a party in the adultery, the king can say, no, I don't want my slave to be killed, right? And he can kind of rescue him. At the same time, a husband may decide that he doesn't want his adulterous wife to be pardoned. And the question that I always ask students when I read this one with them is, why would a husband pardon an adulterous wife? And there's not just one explanation for this. Get your mind working there. Okay, why would he do this? Well, maybe she convinced him that she was an unwilling party in this, that she was actually being raped, right? And there is coverage of rape here, but it seems the burden of proof is placed on the woman in most of these situations. Well, the woman says to her husband, "Look, he forced me. And this is, this is how I can demonstrate this." Well, he could step in and say, "Look, I don't want my wife to be killed." Maybe she is, going back to the point of social advancement that we talked about with the advice letter. Maybe she comes from a more powerful family or a wealthier family than he does, and he knows that he's going to make enemies of his in-laws if he has his wife executed. So maybe that's another reason. Okay, maybe he loves her and he doesn't want her to die, or maybe she's really useful in some other way to him. She's a good cook, or she's he doesn't want to have to take care of the kids or whatever it is, right? So there are lots of reasons for this. Now, the reason that I bring this one up is I think it's a really good example of trying to find the voices of those who don't tend to be represented in sources, specifically women here, right? There are very few ancient sources that were written by women. Women seem to have had literacy less common than men, and women tended to be in these ancient societies denigrated to the point where they existed mostly in the private sphere. They, while lower class or working class women almost certainly did work that anyone who was of a certain status, the woman would not engage in labor, right? And so there's no reason for her, I guess, in that case, to have literacy. Well, we can maybe hear the voice of the woman here, or envision some scenario where a woman was able to exercise her agency. This is what some feminist scholarship tends to do, is to try to find voices of women. So we make a lot of a single clause there, but that's really what you have to do with these ancient sources. Read closely, think about it, use your imagination to come up with possible explanations that are in keeping with the context, right? Of course. We do see that women did have some legal privileges. We might call them rights, but right is really kind of a modern idea. But there was some legal status. If you look at 137, for instance, it notes that if a woman has borne children to a man, that if he wants to separate from her, and this is true whether they're married or not, okay, that he needs to provide child support. And if they are married and the wife received a dowry, which is a part of the inheritance that came from her own family into the marriage, he would have to return the dowry. And so men, could not just divorce their wives without kind of thinking about the consequences of this. And in fact, if a mother is abandoned by the father of children, then she is going to, or rather, if he leaves that relationship, she's going to receive a part of the inheritance, it says. And so, there was legal standing. Now, I want to, leave that point out there because we're going to look at a later law code from the Iron Age and see that this legal position has eroded even further. In the same area of the world, in Mesopotamia, but 1,000 years on, women had no legal standing when it came to divorce. I want to look at one other source briefly in this video here. And this is another very different kind of window into the societies of the ancient world. This is a text from ancient Egypt, and it's specifically from the New Kingdom period of Egypt, though there are similar texts called the Pyramid texts that show up in earlier eras that contain a lot of the same information. It's been given the name the Book of the Dead because this is a document or a text that was placed in tombs. In earlier periods, it was inscribed on the walls of tombs. By the New Kingdom period, they were writing it on papyrus, which was a writing medium made of river reeds that were kind of flattened and mashed together to make something akin to paper, right? But it was written on papyrus, formed into a scroll, and then placed often in the sarcophagus with the person who was being buried. And if you know anything about ancient Egypt, you'll know that they mummified bodies, at least of the elites. They put them in elaborate tombs. They took great care of the dead. They put in grave goods. They even put in things like food and cooking oil and beer and wine and things like that to make sure that the dead person would be supplied with the necessities in the afterlife. And for the view that we get of the Egyptian notion of the afterlife shows that they believed that a lot of the same things that they encountered in their mortal lives would continue to exist in the afterlife. They would essentially be doing the same kinds of things. And one needs to ask, why didn't they envision something much greater or something much different? Well, you have to consider that ancient Egypt, was a pretty nice place to live. People lived in relative abundance. Things were stable. There wasn't a lot of warfare or conflict. And so it's then understandable why they would think, we've got a pretty good life. Well, the afterlife must just be more of this. However, in this text, which seems to have been a kind of set of instructions for the deceased, right? So you put this in the sarcophagus, the deceased wakes up in the afterlife, and they have to navigate the afterlife to achieve their fullest potential in that next life, right? And according to this book, they would encounter certain obstacles. And the book provides instructions on how to navigate those obstacles. Usually it's just a kind of incantation that they would say that they could get rid of the danger and then proceed. There are incantations for if you encounter some deadly animal, like if you come across a serpent or a crocodile or something like that, you just say this incantation and it will leave you alone. If somebody tries to co-opt you, to enslave you, to make you do work or something like that, right, then you say this incantation and they'll leave you alone. And so, this is really what the Book of the Dead consists of. Egyptians, by the way, did not actually call it the Book of the Dead. It was more like the book of her coming forth into the day, which they thought was what actually happened to the person. Tombs were often constructed with doors, or sometimes they were false doors, but they believed that the person would emerge from the tomb during the day and spend time doing the things that the mortals did. They just existed in a kind of different dimension. The key moment, perhaps, in all of the Book of the Dead is this thing depicted here, okay? This is called the weighing of the heart. And the Egyptians believed that the person at death had their life force, right, their ka, as they called it, separated from their physical body, which they called the ba. And that they needed to navigate the afterlife to the point where these things could be reunited. This is not quite the notion of the soul and the body that we later see in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but it's something akin to that, right? There are some key differences that we need not get into here, okay? And so the person had to go through these trials in order to become a full person again. And the weighing of the heart was an important moment, right? So to give you some sense of what's going on here, okay, this figure is the person in question, the person who's going through the afterlife. This is the jackal-headed god Anubis, who is the guide for the afterlife. He's the one who is kind of setting up the weighing of the heart. You'll note that there's a balance here, okay. This is the god Thoth, the recorder god, the messenger god, similar in many ways to the god Hermes or Mercury in the Greco-Roman tradition. Up here there are a number of other gods. Okay, this is Osiris, this is Ra, the god of the sun, Osiris, the god of the underworld, and then these are other deities kind of observing the situation. And then this is the god Amit. I'll mention who that is in just a second here. The person's heart, which is placed in a jar, this is what happens during mummification. They remove many of the internal organs. Some of them they throw away. They didn't think the brain was important. They would just chuck that thing. But they would take the heart and the lungs and the kind of digestive organs and things like that and put them in these jars and place them with the mummified body. They would pack them in salt so they would dry out and not rot. The heart is placed, and on the other side of the scale is a feather. The feather represents the goddess Ma'at, who was the goddess of justice. And you have to ask the question, okay, why a feather, right? Well, because if the heart is weighed down by misdeeds, what we might call sins, but I don't think Egyptians would have thought of it necessarily in those terms, but if they've done things that are wrong or that are socially unacceptable, if they have in some way damaged the society, well, the society continues in the afterlife, and therefore they would be a threat. And so they would not pass the weighing of the heart. Their body and their life force would not be reunited. They would be kind of enslaved or, have a less than good afterlife. If the heart weighs more than the feather, then this deity, Amit, who consists of the head of a crocodile, the forequarters of either a leopard or a lion, and then the hindquarters of a hippopotamus. You have to ask why those three. Well, these were the three most deadly animals the Egyptians knew. They killed lots of people, right? So they're scary things. You combine those three, right? Well, Amit gets to eat the person's heart, and then they are kind of doomed to this second-class status in the afterlife. Thoth here is recording the whole proceeding. During the weighing of the heart, there's a text that was prepared that went along with that image. This is it right here, and this is one of the assigned texts, right? So as part of this, they say, homage to you, great God, Lord of the double Ma'at. So they're addressing Ma'at herself here, okay? And then they make this statement of innocence, right? The kind of negative confession. And it's a series of I have not statements, right? I have not done all of these things that are socially unacceptable, okay? What are those things? Well, I have not oppressed my servants. I have not defrauded the poor of their property. I have not oppressed the members of my family. I have not taken offerings that are left in the temples. I mean, these are rituals were very important to people. Notice I have not fornicated, right? So there were sexual mores that were in place here, much as with the Code of Hammurabi. I have not cheated anyone in the marketplace, like adding weights to the scales to cheat buyers and things like that, right? I have not diverted the running water in a canal. I haven't stolen somebody's irrigation water. That's very important for Egyptian society, okay? I have not held back the water when it should flow. And so, you can see all of these things. Notice here that apart from addressing Ma'at, right, this isn't about God saying you should or should not do these things. It's about the proper functioning of society. That's the basis of ethics. And so both of these civilizations, in their own way, present evidence that shows how society was supposed to function, whether that's a law code or something that was associated with the funerary rituals, right, death and burial and things like that. We can see that there were norms put into place with this. So what I would encourage you to do is to take a look at parts of the text that we haven't examined and just see if anything stands out to you and try to make sense of it. Okay, and we'll go forward with with continuing to examine these primary sources into the Iron Age and see how things what remains the same and what changes. But that's enough for now.